in the winter of 1878. A traveling merchant named Jacob Hensworth arrived in Cedar Valley, Utah, carrying with him a leather satchel that would expose one of the most chilling family secrets in American frontier history. Inside that satchel were genealogical records, birth certificates, and correspondence that revealed the true nature of the Fairmont family, a bloodline that had masqueraded as European nobility for over 30 years, while harboring a genetic predisposition so disturbing that it had shaped 3 generations of calculated cruelty. What Hensworth discovered in those remote Utah mountains wasn't supernatural. It was something far more terrifying, a family that had systematically bred and nurtured the very worst of human nature, passing down not just physical traits, but an inherited capacity for manipulation, violence, and emotional coldness that defied every moral boundary of civilized society. The records he carried contained evidence of murders, disappearances, and a methodical approach to eliminating anyone who threatened to expose their carefully constructed facade. Before we continue with the story of how the Fairmont family's genetic secret was finally revealed, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with our audience from across America. The discovery that would unravel decades of lies began with a simple genealogical inquiry, but it would end with the revelation of a family tree rooted in something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Cedar Valley, Utah, in 1878, was a community of roughly 400 souls, nestled between towering red sandstone cliffs and vast stretches of high desert sage. The valley had been settled by Mormon pioneers in the early 1850s, families who had made the arduous journey west, seeking religious freedom and the promise of fertile land. By the late 1870s, Cedar Valley had grown into a prosperous farming community, with well-established fields of wheat and barley, a thriving cattle industry, and a tight-knit social structure centered around the local Mormon church. The Fairmont family occupied the most prestigious position in this small society. Their sprawling ranch, known locally as Fairmont Estate, covered over 3,000 acres of the valley's most fertile land. The main house, an imposing 2-story structure built from local sandstone, sat atop a gentle rise overlooking the entire community, with its carefully manicured gardens, white picket fences, and rows of imported fruit trees. The Fairmont property stood as a testament to refined taste and considerable wealth, unusual luxuries for a frontier settlement. Patriarch Augustus Fairmont, a distinguished man in his early 60s, commanded respect throughout Cedar Valley. His silver hair was always perfectly groomed, and he carried himself with the bearing of European aristocracy. Augustus claimed his family descended from the noble Fairmont line of Yorkshire, England, a heritage he documented with elaborate family crests, imported furniture, and what appeared to be authentic genealogical records dating back to the 1600s. This noble lineage, he maintained, explained not only the family's natural business acumen, but also their inherent superiority in matters of intellect, character, and social grace. Augustus had arrived in Cedar Valley in 1847 with his young wife Elenina and their infant son Theodore. They had brought with them considerable wealth, enough to purchase the largest tract of land in the valley and establish themselves. Immediately, as the community's social elite, Augustus quickly became a prominent figure in local Mormon leadership, serving as a counselor to the bishop and playing a key role in community decisions. His wife, Elenina, a woman of striking beauty and impeccable manners, led the local Women's Relief Society and was renowned for her charity work and sophisticated social gatherings. The Fairmont children, Theodore, now 31, his younger brother Marcus, 28, and their sister Isabel, 26, were considered the finest examples of young adulthood in the territory. Theodore had inherited his father's commanding presence and business sense, taking over much of the ranch's daily operations. Marcus demonstrated exceptional skill in negotiations and had secured several lucrative contracts for the family's cattle business. Isabel, widely regarded as the most beautiful and accomplished young woman in the valley, had married well to a prosperous merchant family from Salt Lake City, further cementing the Fairmonts' social position. The third generation of Fairmont was equally impressive. Theodore's children, Augustus Jr., a 17, and his twin sister, Victoria, along with Marcus' son, Edgar, 15, were all exceptional students, natural leaders among their peers, and seemed destined to continue the family's legacy of success and social prominence. Community members often remarked on the remarkable consistency of character across Fairmont generations, their intelligence, their natural charisma, their ability to inspire both respect and a subtle sense of intimidation in others. What made the Fairmont family particularly notable in Cedar Valley was not just their wealth or social position, but their seeming immunity to the tragedies that befell other pioneer families. While other households struggled with infant mortality, crop failures, and the countless hardships of frontier life, the Fairmont appeared blessed with unusual good fortune. Their children were remarkably healthy, their business ventures consistently profitable, and their social relationships seemingly free from the conflicts and rivalries that plagued other prominent families. This apparent immunity extended to more serious matters as well. When disputes arose over land boundaries, water rights, or business partnerships, the Fairmont invariably emerged victorious, often after their opponents suffered unexpected setbacks, failed crops, family illnesses, or sudden financial difficulties that forced them to accept unfavorable terms. Community members attributed this to the Fairmont's superior breeding and natural intelligence, never questioning whether there might be more calculated reasons for their consistent success. The Fairmont family's influence extended far beyond their immediate community. Augustus maintained correspondence with business associates throughout the Western Territories, and family members frequently traveled to Salt Lake City, Denver, and even San Francisco on various enterprises. These connections had brought considerable prosperity to Cedar Valley, as the Fairmont often facilitated business opportunities for other community members, further cementing their position as benevolent leaders and protectors of local interests. Jacob Hensworth's arrival in Cedar Valley on that cold February morning in 1878 initially seemed like nothing more than another routine business visit. Hensworth, a professional genealogist and document researcher from Philadelphia, had been commissioned by a wealthy Eastern family to trace their ancestry and verify claims to a substantial inheritance. His research had led him through courthouse records across multiple states, following paper trails that stretched back to the earliest colonial settlements. What had brought Hensworth specifically to Cedar Valley was a discrepancy in inheritance records he'd discovered in the territorial capital. A substantial estate in Pennsylvania, valued at over $50,000, was being claimed by multiple parties, including someone using the name Augustus Fairmont of Cedar Valley, Utah territory. Hensworth's job was to verify the legitimacy of all claims by examining original documentation and conducting interviews with potential heirs. As Hensworth's horse-drawn carriage made its way down the main street of Cedar Valley, past the simple wooden structures and modest homes that characterized most frontier settlements, the imposing Fairmont estate stood out like a European manor house transplanted into the American wilderness. The contrast was so striking that Hensworth later wrote in his journal that he felt as though he had stumbled upon a piece of the old world mysteriously preserved in this remote valley. Hensworth's first meeting with Augustus Fairmont took place on the afternoon of February 15, 1878, in the elegantly appointed study of the Fairmont mansion. The room itself was a remarkable display of refinement for a frontier home. Leather-bound books lined floor-to-ceiling shelves. Oil paintings in gilded frames adorned the walls, and an ornate mahogany desk dominated the center of the space. Augustus received his visitor with the gracious hospitality befitting a man of noble heritage, offering imported brandy and displaying what appeared to be authentic family documents. For the first hour of their meeting, everything proceeded exactly as Hensworth had expected. Augustus produced a leather portfolio containing what seemed to be a comprehensive family genealogy, complete with birth certificates, marriage records, and even a few letters bearing official seals from English parishes. The documentation appeared to trace the Fairmont lineage back through several generations of Yorkshire landowners, establishing Augustus as the legitimate heir to the Pennsylvania estate in question. However, as Hensworth examined the documents more closely, using the trained eye of a professional researcher, he began to notice subtle inconsistencies that troubled him. The paper quality of some supposedly 18th century documents appeared to uniform. Certain official seals, while impressive to the casual observer, contained spelling errors that would never have appeared on authentic government records. Most significantly, the handwriting styles across different decades showed suspicious similarities, as if multiple documents from different time periods had been written by the same person. When Hensworth diplomatically raised these concerns, Augustus Fairmont's demeanor underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. The warm hospitality remained, but underneath it, Hensworth detected something that made him deeply uncomfortable. A cold assessment in Augustus' eyes, as if he were being measured and evaluated in ways that had nothing to do with research. "Mr. Hensworth," Augustus said, his voice maintaining its cultured tone while somehow conveying an underlying threat. "I trust you understand the delicate nature of family histories. Sometimes the preservation of important documents requires creative measures. Surely a man of your experience recognizes that the spirit of truth can be more important than the letter of documentation." That evening, Hensworth was invited to dine with the Fairmont family, an invitation that felt more like a command than a social courtesy. The dinner took place in an impressive dining room with fine china, crystal glassware, and service that would have been remarkable in New York or Philadelphia, let alone a Utah frontier settlement. Present were Augustus and Elalina, their sons Theodore and Marcus, with their wives, and several of the younger generation of Fairmont. What struck Hensworth most powerfully during that dinner was not the luxury of the tunings, but the family dynamics he observed. The Fairmont interacted with each other with a strange combination of formal politeness and underlying tension, as if each conversation contained multiple layers of meaning invisible to outsiders. When discussing community affairs, family members would exchange glances that seemed to convey complex messages. When the conversation touched on families who had left Cedar Valley or business partnerships that had ended badly, the Fairmont displayed what Hensworth later described as an almost clinical detachment from human suffering. Most disturbing was the way the younger generation behaved. Augustus Jr. and Victoria, the 17-year-old twins, possessed an adult sophistication that seemed unnatural for their age. They spoke with careful precision, watched the adults with calculating attention, and seemed to understand implications and subtleties that should have been beyond teenage comprehension. When Ilalanar mentioned a neighboring family whose patriarch had died unexpectedly the previous year, leaving behind a widow and several young children in difficult circumstances, Victoria's response was, "How unfortunate that Mr. Caldwell proved so inadequate to the challenges of frontier life." The coldness in her voice, combined with the meaningful look she exchanged with her brother, sent a chill through Hensworth that had nothing to do with the February weather outside. After dinner, Augustus invited Hensworth to his study for brandy and what he termed a more private discussion. Once the door was closed, Augustus's carefully maintained facade began to slip. He spoke more directly about the realities of frontier life and the natural selection that determined which families thrived and which families merely survived. He hinted at the various misfortunes that had befallen families who had challenged Fairmont interests and suggested that successful men understood the importance of adaptability in their moral frameworks. "Mr. Hensworth," Augustus said, swirling the brandy in his crystal snifter, I hope you'll find that our family documentation meets your professional standards. It would be most unfortunate if technical irregularities were to overshadow the essential truth of our heritage. I trust a man of your intelligence recognizes that some truths are more important than others. The implied threat was unmistakable, but what made Hensworth's blood run cold was the matter-of-fact way Augustus delivered it, as if threatening. A professional researcher was simply a normal part of business negotiations. When Hensworth returned to his room at the local boarding house that night, he found that his satchel had been searched. Nothing was missing, but the careful arrangement of his papers had been disturbed, and a window that he had left securely latched was now slightly ajar. The next morning brought news that would fundamentally change Hensworth's investigation. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who operated the boarding house, informed him that she had received an urgent message during the night. Hensworth's elderly mother in Philadelphia had taken ill and was calling for him. The message, delivered by one of the Fairmont ranch hands, urged him to depart immediately if he hoped to see her before it was too late. Hensworth knew immediately that his mother was in perfect health. He had received a letter from her just days before his departure to Utah. The fabricated emergency was clearly meant to drive him away from Cedar Valley before he could complete his investigation. What terrified him was not just the obvious deception, but the speed and efficiency with which the Fairmont had crafted this elaborate lie. It suggested a level of organization and ruthlessness that went far beyond simple document forgery. Rather than confronting the Fairmont directly, Hensworth decided to play along with their charade while secretly continuing his investigation. He announced his intention to depart immediately, expressing appropriate concern for his mother's health. But instead of leaving the territory, he traveled to the county seat where official records were maintained. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The courthouse records in the territorial capital told a story that contradicted everything the Fairmont family claimed about their origins. According to official immigration and land purchase documents, the family that had arrived in Cedar Valley in 1847 bore the name Flea, not Fairmont. Augustus Flea had purchased his land using gold coins and bank drafts from multiple Eastern financial institutions, a suspicious pattern that suggested either extraordinary wealth or money obtained through questionable means. More troubling were the records that preceded their arrival in Utah. Hensworth's investigation revealed that a family matching the Flea description had been wanted for questioning in connection with a series of mysterious deaths in Missouri and Kansas during their westward journey. In each case, the pattern was remarkably similar. The Fleshers would arrive in a community, establish themselves as respectable citizens, and then various local figures who opposed or competed with them would suffer fatal accidents or sudden illnesses. In Independence, Missouri, a merchant who had refused to sell his store to Augustus Flea was found dead in his home, apparently from a heart attack, though neighbors reported he had been in excellent health just days before. His widow, left with debts and no means of support, sold the store to Flea for a fraction of its value. In Lawrence, Kansas, a local landowner who had disputed Fletcher's claim to a valuable tract of farmland died when his horse threw him while crossing a bridge that local residents later discovered had been deliberately weakened. The pattern extended beyond simple business disputes. In each community where the Fleas had lived, families who had achieved social prominence or who possessed information that could threaten the Fleas' carefully constructed identity would experience a series of escalating misfortunes. Children would fall ill with mysterious ailments. Crops would fail despite favorable weather conditions. Financial investments would collapse after receiving bad advice from trusted sources. What made these incidents particularly sinister was their timing and selectivity. The misfortunes always struck at moments when the victims were most vulnerable, and they invariably benefited the Flea family, either directly through business opportunities or indirectly by eliminating potential rivals or threats. The precision of this pattern suggested not random misfortune, but carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to consolidate power and eliminate opposition. Hensworth's research revealed that the Flea family's true origins could be traced to a small industrial town in Pennsylvania, where they had operated under yet another name, the Fallner. Court records from the 1820s and 1830s showed a family involved in a series of business partnerships that ended badly for their associates. The Fallner businesses were consistently profitable, but their partners and competitors experienced an unusual number of accidents, bankruptcies, and family tragedies. The most disturbing discovery came when Hensworth located a retired sheriff from the Pennsylvania town who remembered the Fallner family. Sheriff Thomas Brennan, now in his 70s and living in retirement, agreed to meet with Hensworth and share his recollections of the family that had dominated his town's business community for over 2 decades. They were different, Brennan told Hensworth during their meeting in a Philadelphia tavern. Not just wealthy or successful, plenty of families achieved that. The Fallners had this way of making people feel evaluated, like they were studying everyone around them, looking for weaknesses, figuring out how to use people. Brennan described a family that operated with an almost military precision in their social and business dealings. Each family member seemed to have specific roles and responsibilities in what he characterized as a campaign to control everything and everyone in their sphere of influence. Children were trained from an early age to observe, manipulate, and report on the activities of other families. Business partnerships were entered into not for mutual benefit, but as opportunities to gain access to competitors' strategies and financial information. The strangest thing, Brennan continued, was how they talked about other people, like they were a different species. I heard old William Fallner once refer to the rest of us as the breeding stock. His son laughed, but it wasn't a joke. They genuinely believed they were superior beings surrounded by inferior creatures that existed for their benefit. The pattern of suspicious deaths and convenient accidents had continued throughout the Fallner's time in Pennsylvania, but the family had been careful never to cross the line into anything that could be definitively proven as murder. Instead, they had mastered the art of creating circumstances that led to predictable outcomes. A business rival would be encouraged to make a risky investment just before a market downturn that the Fallner had anticipated. A political opponent would be provided with information that led him to make accusations he couldn't prove, destroying his credibility. A romantic rival would be maneuvered into compromising situations that ruined his reputation. They had this talent, Brennan explained, for making people destroy themselves. They'd create the conditions, provide the temptation or the pressure, and then stand back and watch their targets make the decisions that ruined their own lives. Technically, they never did anything illegal, but the results were the same as if they'd committed murder. The sheriff's most chilling revelation concerned the family's attitude toward their own children. Brennan had observed the Fallner children from an early age and noted that they were trained with the same systematic approach that the adults applied to their business dealings. Children who showed natural empathy or emotional sensitivity were subjected to what the family termed character-strengthening exercises, psychological conditioning designed to eliminate what they considered weaknesses. I saw William Fallner once force his 8-year-old son to watch while they slaughtered a horse that had injured its leg, Brennan recalled. The boy was crying, begging them to try to heal the animal. His father made him stand there until he stopped crying, then made him help with the butchering. Said it was important for the boy to understand that sentimentality was a luxury they couldn't afford. The family had left Pennsylvania abruptly in 1843, just ahead of a grand jury investigation into a series of suspicious business dealings. They had liquidated their assets with remarkable speed and efficiency, suggesting they had been prepared for a quick departure. Brennan had never learned what had become of them, but he had always suspected they had simply relocated and continued their operations under new identities. Hensworth's investigation revealed that the transformation from Fallner to Flea Fairmont represented more than simple name changes. It was evidence of a sophisticated system for creating new identities and establishing credible backgrounds in communities where they were unknown. The genealogical documents that Augustus had shown him were masterful forgeries, but they were just the most recent iteration of a process the family had perfected over decades. What emerged from Hemsworth's research was a portrait of a family that had systematically bred and nurtured the capacity for manipulation, exploitation, and psychological cruelty across multiple generations. This wasn't a genetic abnormality in any biological sense. It was something far more disturbing, a family culture that had deliberately cultivated the worst aspects of human nature and passed them down as valuable skills. The implications were staggering. If the Fairmont were indeed the same family that had operated as the Fleers, and before that, as the Fallner, then their 30-year residence in Cedar Valley represented the longest and most successful phase of a multi-generational campaign of psychological warfare against unsuspecting communities. Armed with this disturbing information, Hemsworth made the dangerous decision to return to Cedar Valley under the pretext of having found additional documentation that supported the Fairmont's claim to the Pennsylvania inheritance. His real purpose was to gather evidence that could definitively link the current family to their previous identities and potentially expose the full extent of their operations. What he discovered during his second visit to Cedar Valley was even more chilling than his original suspicions had suggested. The community that had initially appeared to be a prosperous and harmonious frontier settlement revealed itself, under closer examination, to be a carefully controlled environment where the Fairmont family exercised near-total dominance through a combination of economic leverage, social manipulation, and what could only be described as systematic intimidation. Hemsworth began his investigation by carefully documenting the history of families who had left Cedar Valley over the previous 3 decades. The official explanation for most departures was simple economic opportunity. Families moving to larger towns, or better farming opportunities elsewhere. But when Hemsworth traced these families through territorial records, he discovered a disturbing pattern. Many of the families who had left Cedar Valley had done so under circumstances that suggested they were fleeing rather than pursuing opportunity. The Morrison family, who had been prominent local merchants, had departed suddenly in 1865 after their eldest son died in what was reported as a hunting accident. However, witnesses Hemsworth interviewed recalled that young James Morrison had been investigating irregularities in grain shipments that the Fairmont had arranged for the territorial government. His death occurred just days before he was scheduled to present his findings to territorial authorities. The Caldwell family, who had operated a successful blacksmith business, left Cedar Valley in 1872 after the patriarch Robert Caldwell suffered what was described as a complete mental breakdown. Local residents remembered Caldwell as a rational, stable man who had suddenly begun making wild accusations about his neighbors and claiming that someone was poisoning his livestock. His erratic behavior had destroyed his credibility in the community, forcing the family to abandon their business and leave in disgrace. What made this case particularly suspicious was that Caldwell's blacksmith shop had been purchased by Theodore Fairmont for substantially less than its actual value. Perhaps most disturbing was the case of the Hartwell family, who had owned the valley's most productive farmland until 1874. The family patriarch, Samuel Hartwell, had been a vocal critic of what he perceived as the Fairmont family's excessive influence over community decisions. In 1873, his opposition to a proposed expansion of Fairmont grazing rights had prevented the motion from passing in the local council. Within 6 months, the Hartwell family had experienced a series of catastrophes. Their prize bull died from a mysterious illness. Their well became contaminated with what appeared to be industrial chemicals, and their teenage daughter suffered a severe fall from her horse that left her permanently disabled. Each individual incident could have been explained as coincidence or misfortune, but the cumulative effect had been to destroy the family's ability to maintain their farm. They had been forced to sell their land to pay for medical expenses, and had departed Cedar Valley as impoverished refugees from what had once been one of the valley's most successful agricultural operations. Hemsworth's investigation revealed that in each case, the families who experienced these misfortunes had one thing in common. They had posed some form of challenge to Fairmont interests, whether through business competition, political opposition, or possession of information that threatened the family's carefully constructed reputation. Even more disturbing was the discovery that several families hadn't left Cedar Valley at all. They had simply disappeared. The Piton family, who had operated a small general store, had reportedly moved to California in 1869. However, Hemsworth could find no trace of them in California territorial records, and their former neighbors admitted, under careful questioning, that the family had vanished without saying goodbye to anyone, leaving behind personal possessions and even family photographs. The Jenkins family, who had challenged the Fairmont's water rights in 1876, had allegedly relocated to Colorado, but again, no records could be found of their arrival in any Colorado community. Their homestead had been abandoned so quickly that crops were left harvested in the fields, and their livestock had been found wandering loose several days after the family's supposed departure. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Cedar Valley intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Of Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling, an elderly widow who had lived in Cedar Valley since its founding, and who had maintained detailed journals throughout her residence there. Mrs. Sterling, now confined to her home by age and illness, agreed to speak with Hemsworth after he convinced her that his research might help bring justice for wrongs that had been ignored for too long. Mrs. Sterling's journals revealed a pattern of systematic intimidation and control that extended far beyond the dramatic cases of families who had left or disappeared. The Fairmont family had created what amounted to a surveillance network within the community, using their economic influence to ensure that information about every family's private affairs flowed back to them. They knew everything about everyone, Mrs. Sterling told Hemsworth, her aged hands trembling as she turned the pages of her journals. Who was having marital troubles, who was struggling financially, who had children with learning difficulties or behavioral problems. They collected information the way other people collect stamps, and they used it just as deliberately. The journals documented instances where the Fairmont had used private information to manipulate community decisions, destroy reputations, and force favorable business arrangements. They had perfected a system of applying pressure at precisely the right moment to achieve their desired outcomes, while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. Mrs. Sterling's most shocking revelation concerned the fate of the families who had mysteriously disappeared. According to her careful observations, these families hadn't left Cedar Valley voluntarily. They had been eliminated by the Fairmont family, using methods that left no obvious evidence of foul play. The Pettons didn't move to California, Mrs. Sterling whispered, her voice barely audible in the dim light of her small parlor. I saw Marcus Fairmont and two of his ranch hands loading something heavy into a wagon. Late one night, about a week after the Petanston supposedly left, they headed toward the old mine hafts up in the canyon. That wagon came back empty, and it had been scrubbed clean. She described observing similar activities after the disappearance of the Jenkins family, and her journals contained detailed notes about the increased activity around abandoned mines and remote areas of the Fairmont property, following the vanishing of families who had posed them. Mrs. Sterling's revelations forced Hemsworth to confront a horrifying possibility. The Fairmont family weren't simply skilled manipulators and fraudsters. They were serial killers who had been operating with impunity for over 3 decades. The scope of their crimes extended far beyond anything he had initially imagined, and The systematic nature of their operations suggested a level of organization and ruthlessness that challenged his understanding of human behavior. But even as this realization struck him, Hensworth began to notice signs that his investigation had not gone undetected. His second stay in Cedar Valley had been marked by a series of subtle but unmistakable indications that he was being watched and evaluated. His room at the boarding house was searched more frequently and more obviously, as if the searchers wanted him to know about their activities. His conversations with longtime residents were interrupted by the convenient arrival of Fairmont family members or their associates. Most ominously, the people he had interviewed began to change their stories, claiming they had been mistaken or misremembered details that had seemed clear during their initial conversations. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house operator, approached him on his fourth evening with obvious nervousness. "Mr. Hensworth," she said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "I think it might be best if you concluded your business here soon. There's been talk in town about your research, and not all of it is friendly. Some folks are saying you're stirring up old troubles that are better left buried." That same evening, Hensworth received an invitation to dine again with the Fairmont family. The invitation was delivered by Augustus Jr., the 17-year-old heir to the family's apparent legacy of sophisticated cruelty. The young man's demeanor during this encounter provided Hensworth with his first direct glimpse into the way the family's system of psychological conditioning affected their children. "Mr. Hensworth," Augustus Jr. said, his voice carrying the same cultured tone as his grandfather's, but with an underlying coldness that seemed almost inhuman in someone so young. "My grandfather is eager to learn about the additional documentation you've discovered. He's particularly interested in understanding how thoroughly you've researched our family's history and what conclusions you've drawn from your investigation." The phrasing of this invitation made it clear that Hensworth was being summoned for interrogation rather than invited for social conversation. More disturbing was the way Augustus Jr. delivered the message with the confident authority of someone who had never questioned his right to intimidate and manipulate adults, and with the calculating precision of someone who had been trained to extract information through psychological pressure. Hensworth's dinner with the Fairmont family on February 23, 1878, became a psychological warfare session disguised as social courtesy. The entire extended family was present, including members he hadn't met during his previous visit. The gathering felt less like a family dinner and more like a tribunal, with Hensworth as the subject of collective evaluation. Throughout the meal, family members took turns asking questions about his research, his findings, and his intentions regarding the Pennsylvania inheritance. Their questions were phrased politely, but the underlying message was unmistakable. They knew he had discovered information that threatened them, and they were assessing the extent of the danger he represented. What made the experience particularly unnerving was the way family members communicated with each other through subtle glances, hand gestures, and seemingly innocent comments that clearly carried coded meanings. They operated as a coordinated unit, each person playing a specific role in what was obviously a well-rehearsed process for dealing with potential threats. Elena Fairmont, the family matriarch, proved to be particularly skilled at psychological manipulation. Her approach combined grandmotherly warmth with subtle threats, creating a disorienting mixture of comfort and menace. "Mr. Hensworth," she said while serving him dessert, "I hope your research has helped you understand what a close-knit community we have here in Cedar Valley. We take care of our own, and we're quite protective of our privacy. I'm sure a man of your intelligence appreciates the importance of discretion in sensitive family matters." The younger generation of Fairmont displayed the same unnatural sophistication Hensworth had noticed during his previous visit, but now he understood it wasn't simply precociousness. It was evidence of systematic training in manipulation and intimidation. Victoria, the 17-year-old daughter, spoke about community members with the detached assessment of a predator evaluating prey. Edgar, the 15-year-old son, demonstrated an adult understanding of leverage and coercion that should have been completely foreign to someone his age. The dinner concluded with Augustus making what amounted to a formal offer of cooperation. "Mr. Hensworth," he said, "I believe we can reach an arrangement that serves everyone's interests. Your research has been thorough and professional, and I'm prepared to provide you with documentation that will satisfy your clients regarding our family's legitimacy. In exchange, I trust you'll agree that certain aspects of our family's history are irrelevant to the specific inheritance question you're investigating." The offer was accompanied by a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be additional genealogical documents, along with a bank draft for a substantial sum of money. What Augustus described as compensation for your time and expertise. The message was clear. Accept their version of the truth, take their money, and leave Cedar Valley without pursuing your investigation further. Hensworth's refusal to accept this arrangement triggered a dramatic change in the family's demeanor. The polite facade didn't completely disappear, but it became noticeably thinner, revealing glimpses of the calculating coldness that lay beneath their carefully constructed personas. "I'm disappointed, Mr. Hensworth," Augustus said, his voice maintaining its cultured tone, while his eyes conveyed unmistakable menace. "I had hoped we could resolve this matter amicably. However, I want you to understand that our family has invested considerable time and effort in establishing our position in this community. We won't allow that investment to be threatened by misunderstandings or misinterpretations of historical events." Theodore Fairmont, Augustus's eldest son, was more direct in his approach. "Mr. Hensworth," he said, "I think you should consider the practical implications of your situation. You're a long way from home, investigating matters that don't really concern you in a community where your presence has already caused considerable disruption. Accidents happen frequently in frontier territories, especially to people who aren't familiar with local conditions." The threat was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone Augustus had used during their previous conversation, but coming from a younger man with obvious physical strength, it carried a more immediate sense of danger. Hensworth realized that he was not only investigating a family of sophisticated criminals. He had placed himself in immediate physical peril by refusing to cooperate with their attempts to control his research. Hensworth's situation became desperate when he returned to his boarding house that evening to find that his room had been ransacked and his research materials were missing. All of his notes, copies of documents, and correspondence had vanished, leaving him with only the materials he had carried with him to dinner. Mrs. Patterson met him at the door with obvious distress, explaining that several men had arrived with what appeared to be an official warrant to search his belongings. "They said you were suspected of fraud and document theft," she explained apologetically. "They had papers that looked official, and I didn't know what else to do. Mr. Hensworth, I think you need to leave Cedar Valley immediately. These are dangerous people, and they have more power here than any outsider can challenge." Hensworth realized that the Fairmont family had used their influence to manufacture legal justification for seizing his evidence. Without his documentation, he would be unable to prove his allegations about their true identity or their history of criminal activities. Worse, his refusal to accept their buyout offer had apparently convinced them that he represented an unacceptable threat to their security. Rather than fleeing immediately, Hensworth made a decision that he later described as either extremely brave or completely foolish. He decided to attempt one final effort to gather definitive proof of the family's crimes. Mrs. Sterling had mentioned seeing suspicious activity near abandoned mine shafts on Fairmont property, and Hensworth resolved to investigate these locations under cover of darkness. On the night of February 24, 1878, Hensworth made his way through the bitter cold toward the remote canyons that bordered the Fairmont estate. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate the rocky terrain while casting deep shadows that offered concealment. The abandoned mine shafts Mrs. Sterling had mentioned were remnants of an unsuccessful copper mining operation from the early 1860s. located in a narrow canyon, approximately 2 miles from the main Fairmont house. What Hemsworth discovered in those mine shafts would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The first shaft he investigated appeared to have been deliberately sealed with rocks and debris, but recent disturbance of the covering suggested ongoing use, using tools he had borrowed from Mrs. Patterson's maintenance shed. Hemsworth managed to create an opening large enough to allow entry. The smell that emerged from the shaft was unmistakable. The sickly sweet odor of decomposition mixed with lime and other chemicals used to accelerate the breakdown of organic matter. Using a lantern he had brought for the investigation, Hemsworth descended into the shaft and found evidence that confirmed his most horrifying suspicions about the Fairmont family's activities. The mine shaft had been converted into a systematic disposal site for human remains. Hemsworth counted the remnants of at least 12 different individuals, arranged with the methodical precision that had characterized all of the family's operations. Personal belongings found among the remains allowed him to identify several of the missing families. Clothing belonging to the Piton children, a distinctive wedding ring that had belonged to Mrs. Jenkins, and a pocket watch that several community members would have recognized as belonging to Samuel Hartwell. But what made this discovery even more disturbing was the evidence of the systematic nature of the killings. The bodies had been arranged in a manner that suggested they had been killed elsewhere and transported to the mine shaft for disposal. More chilling was the discovery of a ledger book wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden in a crevice of the mine wall. The ledger, written in Augustus Fairmont's distinctive handwriting, contained detailed records of what he termed necessary eliminations dating back to their arrival in Cedar Valley in 1847. Each entry included the name of the victim, the date of death, the method used, and a brief explanation of why the elimination had been deemed necessary. The entries read like a businessman's accounting records, devoid of emotion or moral consideration. Robert Caldwell, March 15, 1872. Arsenic poisoning, administered over 6-week period. Subject had discovered irregularities in grain contracts and was preparing to contact territorial authorities. Elimination necessary to preserve family security. Jenkins family, August 3, 1876. Chloroform, followed by manual strangulation. Family had obtained legal counsel regarding water rights dispute. Elimination of entire family necessary to prevent legal complications. James Morrison, October 12, 1865, staged hunting accident, using defective ammunition. Subject had compiled evidence of fraudulent shipping manifests. Elimination, essential to maintain government contracts. The ledger contained entries for over 30 individuals spanning 3 decades. Each death carefully planned and executed to appear accidental or natural. The entries revealed that the Fairmont family had developed an extensive knowledge of poisons, accident staging, and body disposal that allowed them to eliminate threats while maintaining their reputation as respected community leaders. Most horrifying was the discovery that the family viewed these killings not as crimes, but as necessary business operations. The ledger entries included detailed cost-benefit analyses, comparing the potential damage each victim could cause against the resources required for their elimination. The family had developed what amounted to a systematic approach to murder, treating human life as merely another factor to be managed in their pursuit of power and security. As Hemsworth photographed pages of the ledger using a portable camera he had brought for documenting evidence, he heard sounds from outside the mine shaft that made his blood run cold. Voices were approaching, and he recognized the cultured tones of Augustus Fairmont, giving instructions to what sounded like several other men. The genealogist has proven more resourceful than anticipated. Augustus was saying his investigation has progressed beyond acceptable parameters, and his refusal to accept our reasonable offer indicates that he represents a permanent threat to family security. This situation requires immediate resolution. Hemsworth realized that the Fairmont family had anticipated his investigation of the mine shafts and had come to eliminate him, just as they had eliminated dozens of other threats over the previous 3 decades. He was trapped in the mine with only one exit, facing a family of systematic killers who had perfected their methods through years of practice. With remarkable presence of mind, Hensworth managed to hide the ledger and his photographic plates in a different section of the mine before the Fairmont reached the entrance. He then attempted to escape through a secondary tunnel that connected to an adjacent shaft, but the tunnel had partially collapsed and his movement dislodged rocks that alerted his pursuers to his location. The confrontation that followed revealed the true nature of the Fairmont family's operation. Augustus, accompanied by his sons Theodore and Marcus, along with several ranch hands who were clearly complicit in the family's criminal activities, cornered Hensworth in the narrow tunnel between mine shafts. "Mr. Hensworth," Augustus said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space, "you've demonstrated admirable dedication to your research, but I'm afraid your investigation ends here. Your disappearance will be attributed to the hazards of exploring abandoned mine workings, a tragic accident that befalls inexperienced Eastern visitors who underestimate the dangers of our frontier environment." What made this moment particularly terrifying was the calm businesslike manner in which Augustus discussed Hensworth's impending murder. There was no anger, no passion, no indication that he viewed killing as anything other than a routine solution to a practical problem. Theodore and Marcus displayed the same detached professionalism, discussing the logistics of disposing of Hensworth's body and creating a plausible explanation for his disappearance. "We'll need to stage the scene carefully," Theodore observed. "An apparent cave-in that trapped him while he was exploring. His body won't be discovered for months, if ever, and by then, any evidence of foul play will have deteriorated beyond recognition," Marcus added. Practical considerations about disposing of Hensworth's horse and belongings to support the story that he had left Cedar Valley voluntarily before suffering his fatal accident. The conversation revealed that the family had developed detailed protocols for these situations, suggesting that Hensworth was far from their first victim to be eliminated in this manner. However, Hensworth's desperate situation was suddenly transformed by an unexpected intervention. Mrs. Sterling, despite her advanced age and frail health, had followed him to the mine site, concerned about his safety and suspicious of the Fairmont family's activities. She had enlisted the aid of Sheriff Tom Bradley from the territorial capital, who had arrived in Cedar Valley that evening to investigate reports of missing persons. The sound of Sheriff Bradley's voice calling into the mine shaft from outside created immediate chaos among the Fairmont family members. Augustus' calm demeanor vanished, replaced by rapid calculations about damage control and escape options. The family had successfully operated with impunity for 3 decades, partly because they had never been caught in the act of violence by legitimate law enforcement officials. "Augustus Fairmont," Sheriff Bradley called into the mine. "This is Territorial Sheriff Bradley. I have a warrant for your arrest in connection with multiple missing persons cases. Come out with your hands visible and bring Mr. Hensworth with you unharmed." What followed was a tense standoff that lasted nearly an hour. The Fairmont family found themselves trapped in the same mine shaft where they had disposed of so many victims, facing the first serious challenge to their operations since they had arrived in Cedar Valley. Augustus attempted to negotiate, offering bribes and making threats, but Sheriff Bradley had come prepared for resistance and had brought sufficient deputies to overcome any attempt at violent escape. The arrest of the Fairmont family in the early morning hours of February 25, 1878, marked the end of one of the most systematic and long-running criminal enterprises in American frontier history. The evidence Hensworth had gathered, combined with the discovery of the mineshaft disposal site and the detailed ledger of murders, provided overwhelming proof of crimes spanning 3 decades and multiple territories. The subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of the family's operations. Sheriff Bradley's team discovered additional disposal sites on Fairmont, property along with a sophisticated laboratory where the family had developed their knowledge of poisons and chemical methods for accelerating decomposition. Hidden compartments in the Fairmont mansion contained false identity documents, forged genealogies, and correspondence detailing similar operations the family had conducted under different names in Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Kansas. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of detailed psychological profiles the family had compiled on every resident of Cedar Valley. These files contained information about personal weaknesses, financial vulnerabilities, family secrets, and potential leverage points that could be used for manipulation or blackmail. The files revealed that the Fairmont family had been systematically studying and cataloging their neighbors for potential exploitation, treating the entire community as a resource to be managed and controlled. The trial of the Fairmont family began in Salt Lake City in the summer of 1878 and attracted national attention as one of the most sensational criminal cases of the era. Newspaper reporters from eastern cities traveled to Utah to cover the proceedings, fascinated by the story of a family that had masqueraded as European nobility while conducting a decades-long campaign of murder and fraud. Testimony during the trial revealed that the family's system of psychological conditioning had been remarkably effective in creating multiple generations of individuals, capable of viewing other human beings as objects to be manipulated or eliminated. The younger generation of Fairmont showed no remorse for their participation in the family's crimes, apparently genuinely believing that their actions were justified by their inherent superiority over their victims. Augustus Fairmont's testimony provided chilling insights into the family's philosophy and methods. He described their operations not as crimes, but as natural selection in action, claiming that their success proved their genetic and intellectual superiority over the inferior specimens they had eliminated. His calm, rational demeanor, while describing decades of systematic murder, disturbed even experienced court officials and newspaper reporters. "We simply recognized realities that others choose to ignore," Augustus testified. "Human society is a competitive environment where success belongs to those with intelligence and determination to seize opportunities. Those who lack the capacity for strategic thinking and decisive action inevitably become resources for those who possess superior capabilities." Although the trial also revealed that the family's fraudulent genealogy was just one element of an elaborate system for creating and maintaining false identities. They had perfected techniques for forging historical documents, establishing credible backstories, and inserting themselves into communities in ways that immediately established social and economic advantages. Ilala Nina, Fairmont's testimony, provided insights into how the family system was transmitted to subsequent generations. She described a comprehensive program of education that began in early childhood designed to eliminate empathy, develop manipulative skills, and instill the belief that other people existed primarily as resources to be exploited. Children who showed excessive emotional sensitivity required additional training, she explained. "We found that exposure to controlled violence and systematic desensitization exercises effectively eliminated these weaknesses. By adolescence, our children understood that success required the ability to make decisions based on practical considerations rather than sentimental attachments." The younger generation's testimony was particularly disturbing as they demonstrated complete acceptance of their family's worldview and expressed genuine confusion about why their actions were being treated as crimes. Victoria Fairmont, when asked about her feelings regarding the families they had killed, responded, "I don't understand the question. They were obstacles to our family's security and prosperity. Removing obstacles is simply rational behavior." The trial concluded with the conviction of all adult family members on multiple charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Augustus, Eleanor, Theodore, and Marcus Fairmont were sentenced to death by hanging. The younger generation members, being minors, received lengthy prison sentences with the possibility of eventual rehabilitation. though contemporary accounts suggest that efforts to reform their psychological conditioning proved largely unsuccessful. The Fairmont estate was seized by territorial authorities and sold to compensate the families of their victims. The mine shafts where they had disposed of bodies were sealed permanently, and a memorial was erected in Cedar Valley to commemorate the victims of what newspapers had dubbed the Fairmont family murders. Jacob Hensworth returned to Philadelphia profoundly changed by his experience. He continued his career as a genealogical researcher, but his encounter with the Fairmont family had given him a new understanding of the potential for systematic evil that could exist within seemingly normal family structures. He spent the remainder of his career developing methods for detecting fraudulent genealogies and identity falsification, becoming a recognized expert in exposing families who had used false backgrounds to conceal criminal activities. Hensworth's detailed account of his investigation, published in 1879 as The Fairmont Deception, a true account of America's most dangerous family, became a best-selling book and established him as a pioneer in what would later be called criminal psychology. His work provided one of the first systematic studies of how families could transmit antisocial behaviors across generations through deliberate psychological conditioning. The case of the Fairmont family raised disturbing questions about the nature of human evil and the potential for seemingly civilized individuals to engage in systematic cruelty. Their ability to maintain a facade of respectability while conducting decades of murder challenged conventional assumptions about criminal behavior and highlighted the vulnerability of isolated communities to sophisticated predators. The discovery that an entire family could be systematically conditioned to view other human beings as expendable resources sparked debates about the relative influence of genetics versus environment in shaping moral behavior. While the family had claimed their actions were evidence of genetic superiority, the evidence suggested that their capacity for evil had been deliberately cultivated through training and psychological manipulation rather than inherited through biological mechanisms. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the Fairmont family system might not have been unique. Their sophisticated methods for creating false identities, establishing themselves in new communities, and systematically eliminating threats suggested capabilities that could have been developed and refined through contact with other criminal organizations. The possibility that similar families might be operating in other remote communities across the Pax American frontier created widespread anxiety and led to increased scrutiny of prominent families whose backgrounds couldn't be independently verified. The Fairmont case also highlighted the dangers of isolated communities where powerful families could operate with minimal oversight. The family's success had depended partly on Cedar Valley's distance from major population centers and law enforcement agencies, conditions that were common throughout the American frontier during the mid-19th century. This mystery shows us how the isolation and limited communication of frontier life could allow sophisticated criminals to operate with impunity for decades, preying on the trust and social cohesion that were essential for community survival. The Fairmont family's ability to maintain their facade while systematically eliminating threats demonstrates the vulnerability of small communities to predators who understood how to exploit social dynamics and economic dependencies. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Fairmont family's true nature? Or might there have been even darker secrets that died with them? Leave your comment below and share your theories about how many other families might have operated similar schemes throughout American frontier history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The American frontier holds many more disturbing secrets, and we'll continue exploring them together. See you in the next video.